We've all heard of women's intuition, right? Well, men have intuition as well. Intuition is so important when it comes to feeding ourselves and our families in our challenging food environment. This podcast explores a variety of topics related to a powerful, evidence-based eating framework called intuitive eating that integrates instinct, emotion, and rational thought. My hope is that it will help you finally break free of the perpetual diet cycle. This is the Men's Intuition Podcast. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Men's Intuition Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Jeff Ash, and today I have a special guest with me. So I'm excited to have Vanessa Preston on. And Vanessa is a mental health social worker, psychotherapist, and nutritionist. All of those things, all in one person in Australia. She is originally from Kentucky, though. So she has provided assessment and therapy services for 14 years and specializes in treating post-traumatic stress disorder and complex trauma. Vanessa is the creator of the Body and Food Freedom program and the host of the Body and Food Freedom podcast, where she supports women to make peace with food and their bodies. Vanessa's group program focuses on self-compassion, shame resiliency, body image healing, and intuitive eating. So all of that rolled into one. So I'm excited to have Vanessa on today. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think this is an important conversation to have. And I think it's something that often gets completely overlooked in the context of eating, nutrition, our relationship with food. I think it's really easy for people to get focused on the physical aspects of health and just overlook the dramatic impact that our mental health plays.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the more beautiful parts of intuitive eating, right? Is that like holistic view of health, not kind of forgetting about our spiritual, emotional, mental, social health. Where, yeah, you're right. I think we can hone in on the physical aspect a bit too much.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work beyond kind of the intro there. And I'm personally kind of interested in how you ended up in Australia, since you're from Kentucky originally.
Yeah, so I've been in Australia now, in Melbourne, for 12 or 13 years. I had originally come over with my partner at the time, and it was meant to be this like short-term adventure of working here and traveling here, saving money, and then going back to Kentucky. And I just fell in love with the country and the culture. And so it's kind of a little bit of a heartbreaking story that ended beautifully, but he ended up going back to Kentucky and I stayed. And like, I'm married and so happy here, and he's married with little kids in Kentucky. And it's just one of those things, but that's what brought me here. But my heart just made me stay. Yeah. And I do love it here. Like, I could go on about it, but we kind of live in just a smaller place outside of the city near the coast. So we do lots of hiking and camping, and I really enjoy stand-up paddleboarding, just being outside. And yeah, I have a daughter who turns 20 this month. Oh my God. Yeah, no, next month, June. And obviously I had her at quite a young age. So that's like a whole other adventure in my life that I could talk about.
Yeah.
And yeah, like you said, I've worked as a therapist for 14 years, and I've worked with children, adolescents, adults. I've worked with men and women. So I love what I do. And, you know, part of my own lived experience is what pulled my heart into the more kind of nutrition, body image, intuitive eating space. So I struggled with chronic dieting and an eating disorder for a number of years. And so healing from that, paired with my clinical experience, is kind of what has me doing the work I'm doing now. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's not an uncommon kind of story for people to get into the intuitive eating space.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's uncommon for them to go to Australia from Kentucky and then end up staying. That kind of thing. But but the whole intuitive eating thing coming out of that disordered eating background.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, since we're going to be talking about trauma and kind of how it can impact our relationship with food and our bodies, it definitely makes sense then to start off by explaining what we mean by trauma, because I think many people misunderstand what it is and kind of what it constitutes. Like what constitutes trauma. So, personally, I experienced 15 years of trauma in my first marriage in the form of kind of really extreme, over the top verbal and emotional abuse.
Mm-hmm.
But it took me quite a while after my wife had passed away to really acknowledge and understand what had actually happened to me. Like at the time, I didn't even think that I had been traumatized. I just, I was just kind of glad to be able to move on. But then after doing some work, I realized, it was very traumatic. And now I'm dealing with kind of the aftermath and been working through that over that time period. So what is trauma, and what are some common examples of trauma that maybe people don't immediately realize is actually trauma?
Yeah, I mean, well, thank you for sharing that experience, because I think we do need to have more men who are opening up, at least with each other or in some safe space, about experiences like you just said. That's absolutely an example of trauma, intimate partner violence. And I think people have this misconception that it has to include physical abuse, and it doesn't. It can be this more kind of emotional, verbal, ongoing dynamic that's set up that absolutely impacts our physical bodies, our mental health, and the way we feel about ourselves. And, some other examples, like I tend to find that people think when I say PTSD or trauma, that we're talking about kind of military members maybe returning from war and coming back with really classic PTSD symptoms, flashbacks, intrusive memories. And that's absolutely valid. We're contracted here to work with, they're called Open Arms. And so it's a government funded counseling service for veterans and their families and current serving military members. So it's absolutely valid, but it tends to be the thing that people think of with PTSD or trauma, where really there's all these experiences that can lead to trauma, which is really, how does it get stored in our nervous system? How does it impact our relationships and our mental health? And so examples of that, is growing up in an environment where there was any sort of physical, emotional, or verbal abuse from our caregivers absolutely can create a legacy of trauma in our lives without us even knowing. And another kind of example is growing up with a caregiver who just lacks capacity. And I like to say, because when my clients come in and start talking about usually mom or dad, they often feel guilty, or they feel like they have to defend their parents. And I say, look, we can hold that your parents are these complex humans who hopefully were trying their best at the time. And so I'm not placing any judgment on any human when I describe this. But, if we have a parent who has a substance abuse problem, or who might have mental health or mental illness themselves, and they're just unable to really come to the party the way we need them to, that can certainly be a trauma. Something I say to my clients is trauma can also be the absence of something. What's tricky is the presence of something we can define a little bit more. So we can go, oh, well, my mom or dad was abusive, or my partner was emotionally abusive. But neglect is a very real trauma of, we did not get our emotional needs met or physical needs met the way that we so desperately need as children. Some stuff that you probably end up talking about too is things like weight stigma, certainly a trauma, chronic illness, car accidents, bullying, and whether we're talking about growing up and being bullied in school or having bullying happen in the workplace. And so there's all these things that can lead to trauma. That something I find people do is they compare it. So even when I see people one-on-one, they'll say, oh, but I bet you've heard worse. Like, I bet you see people who've been through way, way more terrible things than me. And what I encourage people to do is to honor their subjective experience. if it
Mhm.
impacted you and it was hurtful or painful, that's important to acknowledge without comparing to other people. And one of the things, I've said a couple of times is trauma is really the way it gets stored in the nervous system. And so people can be exposed to a really distressing event without developing PTSD, right? But when I say the way it's stored in the nervous system, there's a few key changes that happen in the brain and the body. And I won't go too deep into this because I find that even with my clients, like we reach a point and then we glaze over. But I'm going to give just like
Yeah.
the hot kind of topics of one is the amygdala. So this is the little almond shaped part in our brain that activates our fight or flight or freeze response. I compare it to a smoke detector because it's really important. Just like a smoke detector lets us know that there's fire and we need to get out to safety, the amygdala does that too. But with trauma, it gets overactivated. So it can kind of be firing, going like, oh, there's danger, there's threat, and really there's not. Then other kind of key players are
Mhm.
cortex that helps with planning, with executive functioning, with thinking kind of rationally. That can be suppressed. And the other kind of key player is called our hippocampus, which is the part of our brain. It's like a clock or a calendar. It helps us kind of time orient. Um, that can actually shrink. And so this is why it can become a little bit difficult for some people with trauma to know the trauma is actually over now, you know?
Mhm.
Um, I'm sure you see this too in your practice, but the other thing I say is trauma can leave us feeling a deep mistrust in other people or ourselves, and really cause havoc on the body
Mhm.
because of that overactivation of the stress response. It can be things like headaches, muscle tension, digestive issues, anxiety, depression. So there's this whole kind of ripple effect and legacy of trauma. And what I find is people can be experiencing that without actually knowing that's what it is. And because I just took like 5 minutes with that answer, I do like to say there is good news. So the good news is our brain does have the ability to change and adapt and heal through neuroplasticity. But the other thing is probably the most healing thing for trauma is safe relationships. I think that's amazing. Like that relationally we can heal that. Um, so I hope I didn't take too long to answer that, but those are that's what comes to my head when I hear trauma. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was a fantastic explanation of and exactly what I was hoping that you would explain is that understanding of what it is, because I think so many people, that comparison thing I
Mm,
think is something that's really common, where you think, well, my trauma, okay, maybe it's traumatic, but it's not as bad as that other person, so I shouldn't be struggling like I am
yeah.
because that other person isn't struggling as bad as I am. But when you really start to look at it, there's so many factors that come into play. Where, for example, I grew up the first 24 years of my life. I had amazing, loving, supporting parents,
Mm,
like the picture perfect parents, if you can imagine such a thing.
yeah.
And so that's how I grew up, and that's how my young infant brain, toddler brain, young child brain was nurtured. And all those wires were, all the wiring in my brain was done at that early age. And so when the traumatic experience happened, it certainly changed me and certainly had a very powerful impact. But it's been different than, say, my kids who went through that same verbal abuse, actually probably at a much deeper level in many
Mm,
ways because of the nature of it. Um, and so it's impacted them quite differently now that they're adults than it did me. Again, I can't compare myself to my kids and say, oh, well, I didn't have to go through it as a child, so I shouldn't be struggling in this area.
yeah.
Likewise, comparing it to the trauma that my wife experienced when she was a child, and
Yeah.
looking at that, and even two people who've experienced the same relatively the same kind of trauma at the same age, and comparing that way is not helpful either. You have people who've been through child sexual trauma as children, and you look at the way that it impacts one, where maybe they have they've been closed off to sexual intimacy, and on the other hand, the other one is just basically giving themselves away to every person that they come in contact with, and they both experience very similar things, but it manifests itself differently.
Yeah.
And likewise, some people, it manifests itself in a relationship with food and an issue like that, and body. And so I'm glad you mentioned that comparison thing, because I think that's a really important aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, people will share with me, for example, going through their parents' divorce, and it was very painful and really changed like they had to go through this grieving process, this whole kind of shift around their sense of safety, stability, predictability. And yeah, that comparison thing almost always comes up. One of my good friends who's a therapist, she says, "Girl, this is not the trauma Olympics." So she will say,
I love that.
We do not compare. So it's very much like, if we have a listener, one of the things that I was thinking about in preparation for this is, it's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences. So it's called ACE, and it is available online for free. And it can kind of walk you through things that could be impacting you. Like you said, everyone's so different. But it will walk you through, and it can be interesting to do that. The only thing that I caution with that is it really doesn't take into account, like what you were talking about with your history. You grew up in a safe, stable, loving home, which builds resilience in your nervous system and everywhere. And so just be mindful, if you jump on and look at the ACE, that it doesn't tell the full story.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that resiliency you mentioned, I think, is something that people can very easily not factor in, because I would say that the trauma that I experienced, because of the resiliency that I developed through a strong upbringing into adulthood, and into basically a strong upbringing and strong loving environment, all the way to full maturity of my brain. My resiliency, I went through got some counseling after my first wife passed away, worked through that. And it was 6 weeks of counseling. And my counselor said that he was confident that I could kind of continue going on and deal with things on my own through normal relationships. Yeah. And that's not the case for my kids, as an example. That they will probably have ongoing need of support in that area. Not that I don't still need that, but I can typically deal with my issues by having a conversation with my wife or my mom or a friend or something like that. Yeah. And so I think that is important to understand that, and also the factors of what your support system looks like and what your environment at home looks like, and your job and all of those things.
Yeah. And this is why I think a person-centered approach is best, because we really hone in on the person, and exactly what you said, kind of a real full picture of how is this impacting them? What supports do they have available? What does kind of their day-to-day look like? So kind of never making assumptions about someone's experience. And, with your children, I think it is worth noting that there's something. Trauma can also happen in witnessing something. So if we witness as children our parents fighting, or kind of a chaotic environment, or verbal abuse, witnessing that is enough to create some trauma in our bodies.
Yeah, well, we often hear about men being less inclined to express hurts and emotional struggles. I know that was me personally. When at the time that my first wife passed away, my attitude toward mental illness, depression, anxiety was that just kind of stop doing that, stop feeling that way.
Just snap out of it.
It was a very ignorant, and it's like, okay, just let's talk this out and then let's move on. And it was a huge slap in the face when I, was actually confronted with having to deal with that, because in many ways that that in that first marriage, the trauma was so bad that I tuned out in many ways and just basically shut down everything. And when it was gone, I mean, I would find myself like totally losing it and bawling, watching like a cartoon where characters interacted in a certain way, but my kids were watching. And I would see this little relationship thing going, and it just like moved me so deeply. And there were just a number of ways that small little things hit me. But anyway, coming back to my question for you, we often hear about men kind of really being less inclined to express hurts and emotional struggles. And is there truth to this generalization? And does trauma tend to affect men and women differently in your experience?
Well, I really thought about that because in preparation for this, and I actually don't think, I think trauma impacts humans full stop, in, like we said, and it can look different, I think, for everybody with some commonalities. But I certainly see, so I work with a lot of men actually, and I see that we do have a culture and society and system in place that really shames men around expressing their emotions. And I certainly do see that. And so I think when we talk about trauma healing or recovery, or trying to kind of improve our mental health, this is often a roadblock for men. They have grown up, whether they heard it in their family or not, they've heard it at school, they've heard it through kind of cultural messages that man up, suck it up, don't be a wimp, or other choice words, right? And so they're shamed often from quite an early age around sharing how they're feeling. And so, and I can't remember if I just said this, but also men will say they don't want to be perceived as weak. So the idea of opening up to a therapist or to their partner or to their mate is foreign because of that. I think too, there's this stigma then too, of not just stigma around expressing emotion, but stigma and help seeking behavior. So I think for men to get to a point of reaching out to professional support, especially, it can take a lot more, almost hitting a version of rock bottom in some way, where they're like, okay, nothing to lose trying this.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think, my experience in myself early on was that I didn't want to talk about that stuff going on. And that certainly wasn't what was modeled to me, which I think was why after my first wife passed away and I was out of that situation, it's kind of funny because I almost went to the other extreme. So while I was wrapped up in that situation, I never talked to anybody about it. My parents didn't even know how extreme the abuse was. And we saw them 3 or 4 days a week and often stayed with them over the entire weekend. So they knew there were issues. They knew that, my wife was a bit harsh and that kind of thing, but they didn't know the full extent of it. And so, I kind of went to the other extreme once I was out of that, and basically just this complete open book, tell everybody everything. So I can, but with my other male friends and other men that I've worked with, it can definitely be really difficult for them to open up about that because, the culture, like you talked about.
Yeah. And something I have to say, because it's come into my head a couple of times, but part of coping with trauma or distressing events in our lives is and our nervous system is wired to do this to survive. We can shut down and kind of disconnect from what's going on. And we can normalize it. And so only after, when we are really in a safer environment, will things come up. So earlier in my career, I worked with a lot more children, and children in pretty unsafe situations, and sometimes who would end up in foster care. And people would expect, the child's been removed from this unsafe environment, and now they're with this really lovely, caring foster carer. And it's going, no, now it starts, because they've kind of reached this, they're in this safe environment. Now things can come up. So it's kind of what you're describing after your first wife died, then it's like, this kind of realization, it sounds like, that was not okay. That actually falls into this category of abuse.
Mhm.
But yeah, so coping with men and women can be this kind of dissociation, that disconnect from our bodies or our environment. Or the other side, getting hypervigilant, anxiety, kind of can't slow down. This is where we see people overworking. I see this a
Mhm.
lot, actually. I would say a lot more with men in my clinical practice of um, overworking, um, or over exercising. It's these ways of coping that are kind of more accepted by society. Um, but the other thing I was thinking about, what do I see men do? I see them brush off their emotional experience, how they're feeling, because there's no immediate solution. And so I think men are taught, like, we need you to be like the knight in shining armor, and we just want you to solve the thing immediately. And there's value in that, but it can also kind of hinder people, because it's like, well, I don't want to sit with how I feel. I just want to like hurry up and solve it. And if I can't, then I'm going to suppress this or avoid it, and move on, which causes lots of
Mhm.
stress and tension in our bodies.
Yeah. Well, it definitely causes problems in relationships
In
too, I think,
relationships,
because
yes.
as an example, I think yeah, I mean, I think when we talked the last time when I was on your podcast, I mentioned my wife's ongoing health issues and chronic health problems and that kind of thing. And one of the things that over the course of that time, I've always tried to be the one to not express any issues or problems so that I didn't heap any more stress onto her because she's already dealing with her issues. And I've found myself, and we've had conversations about this over the years, and I find myself sometimes not expressing my needs or my feelings
Mm.
because I'm afraid of it adding to what she's already dealing with. And so I'm trying to be that stronger person, but it actually backfires because then I'm holding back things that are building up in me that I'm not expressing to her until it becomes a really big issue. And so I don't even give her the opportunity to be there for me, to be that supportive partner, to make the changes if it's a change, if it's something that she's doing that's impacting me in a certain way, and vice versa. She has to make sure she lets me know if there's something I need to do as well. But I think that that's one of the things that I think a lot of men are very susceptible to is that we if we don't express it, it's just going. We're not trusting our partner to be able to handle it, and I don't think that's fair for them.
Yeah, and it does kind of rob a quality of the connection. So sometimes people, like I said, they think what needs to happen is the problem solving part, whereas really what needs to happen is the connection part. And you kind of sit in the crap together
Mhm.
for a minute. Um, you said something and I lost my train of thought, but it was when it comes to relationships. Oh, maybe it will come back to me. Yeah, it's gone. But it was very much in this realm of hate when that happens on a
Yeah.
podcast, especially. um,
No. Well, if it comes up, feel free to jump in and just say,
yeah, I
"Oh,
will.
that thought I
I
had."
will. I will.
Yeah, I'm perfectly fine with an interruption.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're really fantastic and somewhat of a unique blend of psychotherapist and nutritionist, and which means you can do and work with people and their mental health struggles as well as issues related to their eating, which I think is really cool. And so trauma may be directly related to nutrition, like past or current food insecurity and eating disorder, etc. Those kinds of things. However, does trauma impact our eating habits and behaviors even when the traumatic experience has nothing to do with food directly?
Yes. And it came back into my head. So I was going to say before I answer this
Oh,
question
good, good.
and you tell me if you can relate to this or if you see this with your clients, but um, what we risk is if we're not expressing how we're feeling somewhere, especially with our partner, if that's safe to do so, is I think men are taught by society that anger is the only appropriate emotion to show. And so that's sometimes what I see in my work is there's this lovely guy who's sitting with lots of sadness or pain, not knowing how to express it, and it comes out as anger. And so there's this old, I don't know who said it, but quote of anger is sad's bodyguard. There's also a really helpful
Mm.
graphic that's like an iceberg, and above the water is anger, and then below it is sadness and shame and disappointment and confusion and fear and anxiety. And so, the more I think we can practice communicating kind of what sits under that, the less likely we are to kind of lose it with our partners or with our children. So that's what I see come up in relationships a lot, is kind of one partner going, but he's angry all the time. And I'm going, oh, he's just really hurt and he doesn't know how to express it. So I just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Do you see that, the anger thing?
Yes, I'm glad you did, because I mean, I've seen it with a lot of men in general. That usually doesn't come out in my coaching relationships with them, but I've seen it just in my work with men in other contexts, and just in hanging out with friends, and just watching how men respond to that. When you have a man with anger issues, there's probably something much, much deeper down that's actually driving that. It's not just that they're an angry, violent person.
Yeah.
And I mean, that may be the case, but in general, there's probably something that really hurt them at some point, and that they are not feeling safe and able to express.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in terms of kind of trauma impacting food behaviors, this is where I'm going to cheat and look at my notes, because I feel like I could talk for like 2 hours and you're like, Vanessa, wrap up. But the first thing I like to say is, yes, trauma absolutely impacts our food behaviors. And even when we're not going, this specific traumatic event is what's causing it, it's rarely that black and white.
Right.
But one thing I like to say is this is true for all body sizes. There's this really dangerous misconception that, people in larger bodies are walking around with unresolved trauma and low vibration and all of this kind of stuff. There is nothing at all that suggests that to be true in actual non-biased research. So when I talk about this is all body sizes. This eating disorders, that's one thing I see come up, and eating disorders impact lots of people, not just this stereotypical thin white teenage girl standing in front of the mirror. It actually impacts all genders across different races, different body sizes. But one thing I think you brought up pre our interview, but is food scarcity. Food scarcity suggests potentially some poverty or neglect. And so that's a trauma that definitely impacts food behaviors, even if it was only when you were a child and now you're an adult. It can still be having some impact and driving some of the food behaviors, whether it's binge eating or emotional eating, or just eating past fullness, or that sort of thing. So kind of any trauma, I think we can use dieting, eating disorders to try to cope with. Part of that, I think, is it gives us this perceived control. It can offer a way to be distracted. It can offer a way to avoid certain things. It can help us calm down. That's something else I was thinking about, is depending on what's gone on for you in your life, food might actually be the only safe source of happiness, right? So people can really engage in this. It's a way of meeting a need. This is why in the work it's so important to be curious of what need is some of my food behavior serving, and how can I meet that need in another way, not shame it and say it's bad and just try to quit doing it. Usually not as successful. Yeah. The last one that came to my head with food behaviors is trauma has a way of disconnecting us from our bodies, as does anxiety and the stress of modern life. And so we can kind of be walking around, above our necks, like neck up, of kind of in our heads all the
Mhm.
time, not connected to our bodies, what we're feeling, how hungry we are, how full we are. Often people don't even know when I say, what satisfies you? What sounds good? They don't know. They don't know. So I think that's
Mhm.
another way that it can impact our food behavior is we don't even know what's happening with our bodies when we're eating. Much less kind of mindfulness that we teach, like, um,
Yeah.
yeah. What did you think when you had that question of like, what do you see food behavior wise?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing is with that, you know, with food behavior, it goes back to those different experiences that we've had, and like you were saying, it can often be when it's a problem is when it's the primary coping mechanism for dealing with these things,
Yeah.
and that curiosity that you mentioned is one of the things that I when I started learning about intuitive eating and going through the principles that really stood out to me. It was like this is what's missing from approaches that so many people are trying to use to deal with their relationship with food. So, a person is struggling with binge eating and feeling out of control in their eating, and they're obsessed with sweets or whatever the case is,
Yeah.
and so they think, oh, I need to just stop emotional eating, and even well-meaning coaches will tell them, oh yeah, well let's we need to stop your emotional eating. Let's find distractions, brush your teeth instead. And when, that signifies that you're done, or fill yourself up with water, or go for a walk, or
Yeah.
whatever. But they never actually help them to understand, well, there's something here, that this need that needs to be met. And you're trying to meet it with something that's never going to meet the need.
Mm.
Let's let's just see what that may be. And I know that since you're a psychotherapist, you can dig deeper in that way than someone like myself, who I have to be careful not to cross lines from from intuitive eating coaching
Yeah.
and that kind of thing into psychotherapy, because that can be a dangerous road to go down. But that's one of the things I love about that principle of intuitive eating, coping with your emotions with kindness. And they used to say coping with your emotions without food. And I think those two together is a good way of thinking about it. Coping with your emotions without using food all the time,
Yeah.
but you can't just yank it out. Like you had mentioned, just trying to stop it cold turkey, because if that's your coping mechanism, you've got to put something else in there. And I think that's where so much value comes in going in that seeking out therapy and help, and whatever context, whether that's professionally or just really expressing yourself to your partner or to a trusted friend,
Yeah.
or whatever the case may be, to really find ways to cope with that, so that then you don't always have to use food, and you can gradually shift to coping with your emotions with things that will help you
Yeah.
actually deal with it instead of just mask it.
Yeah. I think it was my previous mentor, but she said something about emotional eating is actually really valuable because it can elevate the conversation away from food into what you're needing, like we're talking about. So staying curious about,
Hmm.
one of the things that I used to do that I don't do anymore is on the way home from work, as I mentioned, worked lots more with children and really just heartbreaking situations. And clients who are dealing with some, just stuff. And when I would leave, my body, like I would feel so kind of, I think I had absorbed so much of that I was taking aspects of it home with me. And so it turned into these binges on the way home where it would be like, I'm going to hit up the petrol stations. I'm going to get this and that. And it would just be this way of trying to soothe myself emotionally, trying to calm my nervous system from kind of how heightened it was.
Hmm.
And so if someone had said to me, just drink water, that's kind of a band-aid on, and that doesn't even to
Yeah.
me take therapy. It just takes the curiosity of what is happening for me in this moment and how
Hmm.
can I get creative and meet the need in a way that feels healthier and healthier mind, body, kind of
Yeah.
soul level, not diet culture healthier.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah,
But
I think
yeah,
that's so important. That's just a matter of asking questions, simple
yeah,
questions sometimes, like what are you feeling at that time, when you're having those binges. And again, that's where it's nice that I don't have to cross that line into therapy, because if they
yeah,
do need some more, I can recommend that they talk to somebody.
yeah,
But often it isn't this deep, dark,
yeah.
heavy thing. It's just that they're lonely, and
Ugh.
and they've recognized, or they're tired, they're
Mhm.
mentally tired, and just recognizing, oh, I'm just mentally drained from, yes, I went through some trauma in my past. That's not super important as far
Yeah,
as the details of it.
yeah,
That impacts my mental capacity, but ultimately, I just finished a 12-hour day. I didn't get a break over the weekend, and that's why I was so stressed. And so just that simple curiosity of figuring out, what was it, and
yeah,
then you can identify those things and really
yeah,
find better ways of coping.
yeah. And you said the word loneliness. That is, if I put on my psychotherapy hat and track all the way back to childhood and dig up some stuff, often it's the emotion that can be triggering of loneliness, or loneliness is a huge one, or boredom,
Mhm.
or anxiety. And so it is, this is why what we were talking about earlier, of kind of just getting in this habit of being curious and checking in, what am I feeling and what am I needing?
Mhm.
And something I want to say, because we are talking about trauma, is it's kind of a buzzword, trauma, especially on social media. I don't know if that's just my algorithms or but I want to clarify for people listening, it's even staying curious about how certain things are impacting you, but you don't have to go on kind of a witch hunt of like digging into things. Your mind and body will usually reveal what it needs to when it's time. So if it's okay to go back to your own
Mhm.
experience of after your first wife died, it sounds like your mind and body were going, this is what we need to deal with. That whole like mental health and just snap out of it is not working. And so I don't, I would hate for someone to listen and think we always have to dig. Do you get what I'm saying? It's kind of, we can actually,
Yeah.
trauma work isn't always digging into the memory. In fact, most of the time it's not that. It's what we're talking about. How do I
Mhm.
feel? What do I notice in my body? Can
Yeah.
I be curious? Can I be compassionate? What's this pattern with food really about? Um, so yeah, it's not always
Mhm.
kind of that. Yeah. Does that make sense when I say that?
Yeah, I think that's no, it absolutely does, and I think it is. It's really easy when you're talking about those things to be misunderstood, that it's digging super deep and dealing with it, and pulling up all those deep dark memories from the past.
Hmm.
And there may be times when you do that
Yeah.
with your in your work, but when it comes to our relationship with food and stuff, often we don't need to do that. And when I'm working with clients and something comes up trauma related, I certainly don't try and explore that deeper
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
them, because
Yeah.
it that's not my place. But it's also may not even really be necessary or helpful in that situation.
Yeah.
It's just simply identifying that there's something that's bringing up this memory, and then helping them to find ways that they can better cope
Yeah.
with it, like you were talking about there.
Yeah. And I think the
Yeah.
in
Well, how does
terms,
dieting negatively? Oh, go ahead.
yes, that's exactly what I was going to say is we were on the same page there, because I was thinking of another food behavior and pattern is dieting. And like I think, maybe this is a bold statement, I think dieting is always in almost all situations a way of coping with something deeper. Because when we're dieting, like I said, it can give us this false sense of control. Um, it can give us something else to focus on. So it's kind of going, that whole emotion stuff that you're talking about, or reconnecting with my partner, or repairing things with my children, hard, scary basket. So I'm going to fill my time with over exercising and manipulating my body and obsessing about what I'm eating and tracking macros or calories or whatever that looks like for the person. So one of my favorite mantras is understand what it's holding together before we undo it. So for someone listening going, well, what is this dieting thing actually doing for me? Like, how is it kind of
Mhm.
helpful? Because we need to understand what need it's serving before we undo it, you know? And, but then it's usually there's some harm
Yeah.
being done. Like the loop of dieting. And I think you mentioned this. I don't know if it was one of your other episodes I listened to, but I think you mentioned experiencing similar when you were really cutting and training hard. But with dieting, we can't sustain it. Me and you know that. We can sustain it short term for most people. Maybe we have that like unicorn who can just do it. But it usually we do it short term. We usually end up kind of falling off the wagon, so to speak, or eating the quote bad food or cheating on the weekend or, kind of falling off the wagon, whatever that looks like. And sometimes there's that guilt and shame that kicks in of like, what's wrong with me? Why don't I have more discipline? Why don't I have more willpower? And then we go like, now we're starting again, those Monday moments of it's Monday, I'm going to restart this and do my, going to do this. And in that loop, what's happening so often under it is we are stuck in this loop where we are reinforcing problematic core beliefs about ourselves. And I don't think people are necessarily always aware of it. But when I dig that layer deeper, it's usually core beliefs of I'm not good enough, I'm unlovable, I'm worthless. And it can take people a little bit of time to actually see that. But so it's this, on the diet, I failed, I'm going to jump back on. And every time we hit that fail, it
Mhm.
reinstalls these core beliefs that were potentially, do you get what I'm saying? So
Mhm.
it's this like dangerous kind of loop.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because that explains why we keep going back to that dieting. We're trying to meet that need, trying to resolve that issue that we're struggling with, but then the dieting reinforces those beliefs, and it's those beliefs that drive us to want to diet, and then the diet reinforces them, and it's just
Cycle.
this cycle, and you can see why people are constantly on and off, and it reminds me of one of the things that's as common among men, especially in lifting groups. And I'm in a couple of fitness groups, and one is it's called Bacon Bibles and Barbells. It's basically power lifters talking
Bacon
about their
barbell.
eating large
That's
pizzas and lifting
awesome.
enormous amounts of ridiculous amounts of food,
Yeah.
ridiculous amounts of weight. And yeah, it's a really fun group. But anyway, it's a number of times it comes up pretty regularly. Every few months, somebody comments about how the gym is their therapy and lifting is their therapy and that kind of a thing. And
Mhm.
it kind of makes me think of what you were talking about there, where they know that there's something going on that they're trying to deal with, and they're using this other thing. And not that it can't be beneficial,
Yeah.
because it can. I mean, there's research showing that physical activity can be very beneficial to our mental health and help with things like depression and things like that. So it's not that it's bad, but if you're constantly turning to that to try and resolve problems that aren't related to that, um, then yeah, you can see how that, yeah, definitely exactly what you were saying there. That
Yeah.
makes so much sense.
My husband calls that the distractor. So you're kind of using
Hmm.
something more surfacey to distract from what maybe actually needs addressed. Often the distractor is what brings someone to therapy. And then we go that layer deeper of like, oh,
Hmm.
it's actually this thing that we need to work through. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. And something else when I think about this kind of dieting and trauma link is there is trauma in the body image space. And I think dieting can be a way of trying to cope with that, whether it's deep body shame or things like weight stigma, or if we've been taught, which all of us have, I think men, women, whether it's taught in our families or just kind of this cultural environment, is we're taught that our worth is in our bodies. So, what our appearance is. Um, if we did grow up in
Hmm.
an environment where our parents were really critical or we were rewarded, we all are rewarded for this. But if we're rewarded for shrinking our bodies or for men getting like big and muscular and toned, um,
Yeah.
then dieting can be this way of kind of pursuing a sense of belonging or a sense of acceptance or a sense of connection. And depending on the person, that can run all the way deep into our family of origin, or it can kind of be more, like I said, this systemic cultural thing of it gives a sense of belonging. And you said something too.
Yeah.
It's never black and white. So when you were talking about those guys coming in the gym and going, this is my therapy, there's truth in that. That's going to be helping process all kinds of the connection with each other, the body movement. There's therapeutic things about that. And there can still be deeper issues being avoided. So it's rarely
right.
Something's good and bad, good or bad.
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. Cause I know there's been that the physical activity, the gym, my exercise and workouts and stuff is one way that I think of self-care for myself, as I mentioned, with the ongoing health issues and those kinds of things, that gives me a chance to kind of go step away and just have time to myself. And so it can be very therapeutic in many ways, but I do have to be conscious of the fact that that's not going to resolve different things that I may be struggling with. It's one of those things. But again, it comes back to the food thing. Food, it's okay to use food as a coping mechanism. It's okay to use that to eat emotionally. And I think that's something that a lot of people, unfortunately, I think it gets a bad rap. Yeah. But eating for emotional reasons is okay. It's just if it's your only coping mechanism, or if you say food's my therapy, or the gym's my therapy, or this, then and if those are your primary coping mechanisms, that's when can become really problematic, because there are other things that doesn't address every need that you have.
Yeah. And even when you were saying that, even the idea of like a curious reflection, I think reflective practice is one of the most helpful things. So taking a step back, and if it's talking to a coach or a friend, or just thinking about it in your own head, what is this thing helping me with? How is it maybe harming me? Like, how do I know I've moved into the territory of this being problematic? So, for example, emotional eating or training in the gym, fabulous coping mechanisms. How do you know in yourself when it's moved into problematic territory? Is it's become obsessive? Is it because you're shaming yourself when you miss a session because you feel sick? Is it like, how do you know for yourself when it's become problematic? And then we hold both parts. Parts are helpful, parts are problematic. How else can we start meeting needs? Such a kind of cliche thing, but like a toolbox of coping mechanisms of what else can we add, not necessarily take away.
Right. Yeah. Because when you start adding things, it naturally adds in more balance to it. If you start the food example, if you start eating more vegetables, you're probably going to naturally eat less of something else, because otherwise you're going to just be stuffed all the time. Yeah. And so it's not it's not that you're trying to replace it. It's just you're adding in something that may be missing, that may bring some benefit to you. And in the process, it adds that balance to everything else.
Yeah. And that example I shared, we're kind of driving home from work and binging. This was a slower process, but now it's more of a process of, I always do a little bit of breathing before I leave the office. I'll have something ready, like kombucha. I just really find it like good. It's like, what is it? It's kind of like has the bubbles. It has good flavor. It's easy to have ready. And I have a snack that I know is going to satisfy me. So I know the combination of sweet and salty. So I'm still using food, but I'm using it in a way that feels kind of at a deeper level more helpful. So it's kind of like adding in these different strategies.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it sounds like these are the kinds of things that you probably go over in your body and food freedom program, isn't it? That you basically help your your group members kind of work through these different things and identify these different things, and so that they can then cope better with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the program that I do is 16 weeks, and it goes through some of the body stuff we've talked about, actually, more the nervous system, but not in a jargony way, more in like a practical way.
Mm-hmm.
Self-compassion, shame, resiliency, body image healing, and then the principles of intuitive eating that we both teach. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's funny because, again, I think my mentor said this, but the relationship with food parallels the relationship we have with ourselves. And so if we think about food and it's obsessive, rigid, black and white, all or nothing, that stuff's usually showing up in our parenting, in our relationships, in the way we relate to ourselves, right? So
Yeah.
that's kind of, yeah, that's definitely some of the stuff that I teach in my group work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, yeah, and I just encourage any of you listening. I obviously this is Men's Intuition
Yeah.
podcast, but I have a lot of female listeners, and any guys listening, if you have a woman in your life who you think might be able to benefit, where can people find you? Find more information about you? Follow your excellent content on social media? Maybe even get involved in your program for women?
Yeah, so it's my usually when I'm online, it's Instagram, so it's Vanessa_Preston_. I have a website which is Green Life, like LIFE psychology.com. You can jump on that, and there's a body and food freedom page where you can learn about the podcast and my group. I also have some a new exciting freebie that it's not released yet, but I can't wait. And a new offer that is accessible
Oh,
across
okay.
the time zones and affordable. So I have some new
Awesome.
stuff
Yeah.
coming out.
Well, is that something you can share now, or is it still in the works
Well,
and
I've
coming
nerded
soon?
out, and I have this cool plan of like revealing it over a week. So,
Oh, cool.
so
All right. Well,
jump on Instagram.
yeah,
Yeah.
I was just about to say, go follow Vanessa. She puts out really, really practical,
Oh,
good
thank you.
content on Instagram every day, and it's very easy to read. It's very easy to understand. It's applicable to men and women equally, I think. And yeah, I mean, it's just I've definitely learned a lot from her, which is, of course, why I wanted to have her here
Well, thank
on the
you.
podcast. So,
Yeah.
thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us and share such fantastic information. I was thinking throughout this whole thing, I'm like, I'm going to go back and listen to this again,
Yeah.
and probably several times. I'm working on my own group program for men, and in those lessons that we're going through, that we're going to be going through, I'm adding additional resources to kind of help in some of those areas. And this will definitely be they'll definitely be getting a link to this
Yeah,
this
that's
podcast
awesome.
episode, because I think you just provided some fantastic information. So thank you
Well,
so
thank
much
you for having me.
Yeah, and I'll put all the contact info in the show notes. So anybody who has been listening, you'll be able to get in contact with Vanessa if you think she might be able to help you, or if you're just wanting to continue learning more from her as you go through this journey. So thank you again, everyone, for listening. I look forward to bringing you another episode soon, and hope you all have a wonderful day.